I stopped at the West Wing service door because it was unlocked. That door is logged, sealed, and checked every hour. The log tablet beside it was dark. Inside, a child's slipper lay against the skirting board, turned the wrong way. I did not call it in. I stood there, listening to the quiet, feeling protocol pull one way and instinct the other, knowing something had already crossed the threshold. The guard remained still for a full 5 seconds, long enough for the silence to register as abnormal, long enough for the absence of sound to feel heavier than noise, before he stepped fully into the West Wing service corridor and let the door close behind him without engaging the automatic seal, the latch resting open by a fraction that should not have existed. The corridor lighting was set to night protocol, dimmed to a level that preserved visibility without glare, casting long shadows along the polished floor. And it was that floor he watched first, not the walls or the ceiling cameras, because floors recorded what people tried to forget: scuffs, moisture, displaced objects. The slipper lay exactly where a child would have stopped walking, toe angled inward, heel twisted slightly as if removed without care, and the guard felt the procedural sequence in his head slow and then falter, the checklist he had followed for 15 years no longer aligning cleanly with what was in front of him. He did not touch the slipper. He keyed his wrist unit to silent and checked the corridor sensors manually, confirming motion inactivity that did not match the absence of logging, then moved to the wall terminal and brought up the local security feed, the screen blooming softly in the low light. The camera timeline showed a clean dropout of 1 minute and 12 seconds, not a failure, not an error flag, but a deliberate pause, the kind that only happened when an override code was entered correctly. He noted the timestamp without recording it, committing it to memory instead, and shifted his stance so his body blocked the corridor intersection behind him, a small physical barrier that would slow anyone approaching without appearing defensive. His breathing remained even, controlled, but his attention narrowed, the way it did when variables refused to resolve. Protocol dictated immediate reporting of an unlogged access and camera interruption, yet protocol also assumed the absence of a vulnerable party, and the slipper altered that assumption entirely, turning a technical breach into something else. He moved forward, footsteps placed precisely within the darker bands of shadow to minimize reflection, passing the child's quarters wing without entering, resisting the urge to check, because premature confirmation would force escalation he was not yet prepared to initiate. At the secondary junction, he paused again, listening, the distant hum of ventilation the only sound, and accessed the internal movement ledger, scrolling back through the night entries until he found the gap, a single missing confirmation where a biometric acknowledgement should have been, cleanly excised rather than corrupted. Someone had known exactly what to remove. The guard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as he keyed a temporary containment protocol for the immediate corridor, rerouting routine patrol traffic away under the pretext of maintenance, a minor authority he was permitted to exercise without explanation, buying himself minutes that felt both necessary and dangerous. He turned back once more toward the service door, confirming it remained unsecured, and understood then that the irregularity was not the door, not the log, not even the slipper, but the sequence, the order in which these things had been left behind, as if someone had believed time itself could be managed. He knelt at last, not to examine the slipper closely, but to place a discrete location marker beside it, invisible to anyone without clearance, and rose smoothly, the motion practiced, his expression unchanged, despite the calculation now running beneath it, weighing obligation against consequence.
A voice came faintly over the general channel, a routine status inquiry from another section, and he answered with measured brevity, his tone steady enough to invite no further questions, then muted the channel again, aware that every additional voice increased the risk of attention. He moved toward the auxiliary access panel near the stairwell and ran a deeper diagnostic, fingers moving with economy, confirming that the override code used was valid, current, and assigned to a senior clearance tier, the kind that bypassed secondary alerts by design. And the realization settled without drama, without shock, only a tightening in his shoulders as the shape of the problem became clearer. This was not intrusion, it was permission misused. He adjusted the corridor temperature by 2 degrees, a negligible change to most, but enough to encourage staff to remain in their assigned zones, and positioned himself where he could observe both the service door and the stairwell without appearing to guard either, posture relaxed, hands resting lightly at his sides. Minutes passed, marked only by the subtle shift of light as the automated system cycled, and in that time he rehearsed the first report he would give if forced, careful to keep it factual, stripped of inference, because inference invited dismissal. A distant footfall echoed briefly and then receded, someone redirected by my containment order, and he noted with quiet approval that the system was obeying him, at least for now. His gaze returned to the slipper, the smallness of it, the way it did not belong in a corridor designed for state movement and formal passage, and he felt the instinct to remove it rise and be suppressed. Evidence required preservation, even when it felt wrong to leave it there. He checked the time again, calculating how long he could reasonably delay before absence itself became suspicious, and made the decision to expand the containment by 1 node, sealing the adjacent service lift under a maintenance flag that would draw minimal scrutiny. When he straightened, the faint reflection in the wall panel showed a man outwardly unchanged, uniform immaculate, insignia catching the low light, but internally aligned now toward a single priority that protocol did not articulate clearly enough to absolve him. Somewhere beyond the corridor, the palace continued its night routines, unaware, and the guard accepted that once he crossed the next threshold, the matter would no longer be containable, that names would attach themselves to the gap in the log, and that rank would complicate what evidence could not. He took one final look at the service door, still fractionally open, and stepped past the point where turning back would have been the simpler choice, initiating the next sequence with a controlled breath, knowing that the unlogged minute had already expanded into something that would not remain quiet. The guard encountered the official at the junction outside the administrative stairwell, exactly where the corridor widened and the lighting brightened by design, a place meant to discourage lingering and encourage transparency. And the man stood there with the easy posture of someone accustomed to not being questioned, coat unbuttoned, identification badge visible but not presented, as if visibility alone were sufficient. The guard registered the details automatically, the lack of escort, the absence of logged movement, the way the official's gaze flicked briefly toward the sealed service lift before settling back into polite neutrality, and he adjusted his own position to maintain a respectful distance that also controlled the space. Their exchange began with routine words, the kind that carried no weight on their own, the official referencing a late-night review request, a matter of scheduling, his tone calm and unhurried, and the guard listened without interruption, noting that no request of that nature existed in the operational briefings he had reviewed before taking post. He asked for clearance confirmation, not as a challenge but as procedure, and watched the official's hand hesitate for a fraction of a second before producing the code verbally rather than through the wrist terminal, a small deviation that meant nothing in isolation and everything in context. The code checked out when the guard verified it silently, senior tier, broad access, yet its use here conflicted with the movement ledger, and the guard felt the pressure of hierarchy settle into the exchange, the unspoken expectation that he would defer and step aside. He did not. Instead, he cited the temporary containment in neutral terms, maintenance reroutes, minor disruptions, and observed the official's expression tighten just enough to confirm awareness of the blockage ahead. The corridor seemed quieter then, the air faintly cooler, and the guard sensed the balance shifting from routine interaction to something more delicate, where every word would be remembered later. The official questioned the necessity of the containment, not aggressively, but with a practiced incredulity that implied error rather than malice, and the guard responded with measured clarity, avoiding mention of the missing log or the child's slipper, because those facts would escalate the matter beyond what could still be controlled. He offered an alternative route, longer and less direct, and watched as the official weighed the inconvenience against the risk of pressing further, the calculation visible in the set of his jaw. When the official agreed, it was with a smile that did not reach his eyes, and as he moved away, the guard noted the direction, the pace, the absence of protest, all of it reinforcing the conclusion forming quietly in his mind that this was not confusion, but confidence, the kind that came from believing authority would smooth over any irregularity after the fact. Once the official disappeared around the corner, the guard did not relax his stance, instead shifting immediately to his wrist unit and flagging the encounter in the internal buffer, a provisional record that could be formalized later if needed, and expanded the containment perimeter by another segment, careful to keep the changes subtle, nested within existing night protocols. He replayed the conversation in his head without emotion, isolating the points that mattered, the verbal clearance, the hesitation, the choice of route, and confirmed that the official's explanation still failed to account for the camera blackout or the unlogged access, gaps that authority alone could not fill. A faint vibration signaled an incoming priority query from central oversight, triggered by the cumulative adjustments he had made, and he responded with a concise status update that framed the situation as procedural alignment rather than anomaly, buying himself further time without falsehood. The palace around him felt different now, not dangerous, but alert, systems responding to his inputs in ways that suggested others might soon notice the pattern, and he accepted that his margin for independent action was narrowing. He returned briefly to the service corridor, confirming the slipper remained undisturbed and that no new movement had occurred, then repositioned himself near the main administrative access, a visible presence designed to discourage casual passage. Another official passed, Junior, offered a nod, continued on, unaware, and the guard marked the contrast, how easily routine continued alongside something that was not. He accessed the movement ledger again and traced the senior official's clearance history backward, finding a cluster of late entries over recent weeks, all legitimate on paper, all unremarked, yet together formed a pattern of quiet access that no one had questioned because no one had been harmed, at least not visibly. The guard closed the file and straightened, feeling the weight of inevitability settle, understanding that the next step would require confronting the issue directly, attaching evidence to authority rather than deferring to it. He checked the time and adjusted his report outline mentally, knowing it would need to be precise, restrained, and defensible, because once a name entered the record, there would be no returning to containment alone. The night remained calm, the palace steady, but the guard stood with the awareness that calm was no longer neutral, that it now concealed a misuse that had already crossed into proximity with a child, and that whatever followed would test not his courage, but his adherence to a duty that did not bend simply because someone expected it to.
The guard moved through the West Wing with deliberate normality, his pace unhurried, his posture unchanged, allowing the palace systems to read him as routine, while his attention tracked the finer signals that routine concealed, the faint delay in door responses, the soft click of relays engaging under secondary command, the way the lighting ahead brightened a fraction earlier than scheduled, as if anticipating passage. He followed the senior official's earlier route not by proximity, but by absence, by the pattern of cleared spaces that should have shown traces of traffic and did not. And when he reached the outer threshold of Princess Anne's residential corridor, he stopped short of the formal marker, remaining within the zone where his presence could still be explained as patrol rather than intervention. The corridor was warmer here, insulated for comfort, and quieter, the sound-dampening panels absorbing even his measured footfalls, and it was that quiet that made the irregularity stand out, a door not fully seated, the smallest visible line of light at its base. He did not approach immediately. Instead, he accessed the local feed again and confirmed that the camera covering the corridor had resumed normal operation immediately after the blackout, its field of view now unremarkable, offering no explanation for what had occurred during the missing minute. He keyed a silent alert to the child protection protocol, not the full alarm, but the preparatory layer that summoned a discreet medical and welfare response without sirens or announcements, and then advanced, stopping just far enough from the door to hear the low movement inside, a chair shifting, fabric brushing against fabric. He announced himself softly, rank and role stated without urgency, and waited, his gaze fixed on the threshold rather than the interior beyond, allowing those inside to respond without feeling cornered. The door opened slowly, revealing the senior official first, composed, expression neutral, followed by the interior of the room where Princess Anne sat on the edge of a small sofa, her posture rigid, her attention fixed on a point just past the guard's shoulder, and beside her, slightly behind, the child stood barefoot, one slipper missing, hands clasped tightly together. The guard registered the scene in a single controlled sweep, the absence of distress signals, the lack of physical harm, the tension held rather than released, and stepped aside just enough to create space, his body language signaling containment rather than accusation. He addressed the official with formal courtesy and requested immediate clarification of presence and purpose, and as the official began to speak, the guard watched the child instead, noting the shallow breathing, the way her weight shifted from foot to foot, and made a small, deliberate adjustment to his stance that placed him subtly between her and the door. The explanation given was precise and incomplete, framed as reassurance, a late-night check prompted by concern, authority presented as care, and the guard listened without interruption, cataloging the omissions rather than the statements, the absence of a scheduled request, the failure to notify residential security, the use of an override that erased its own trace. When the official finished, the guard acknowledged the account without endorsement and turned his attention to Princess Anne, requesting confirmation of her consent for the visit, his tone unchanged, his words minimal, and she nodded once, slowly, adding nothing further, her restraint speaking more clearly than elaboration would have. The guard accepted the confirmation and proceeded with the next step, informing them both that a temporary lockdown of the West Wing would be initiated as a matter of protocol review, his phrasing careful, non-accusatory, but final, and watched the official's composure tighten again, this time with an edge of urgency that had not been present before.
The child shifted closer to Princess Anne, and the guard responded by signaling the welfare team through his wrist unit, their arrival timed to appear routine, and then guided the official toward the corridor, offering the dignity of movement rather than restraint, while ensuring that 2 additional guards appeared at either end of the hall, their presence quiet but unmistakable. The lockdown engaged without fanfare, access points sealing in sequence, internal routes rerouted, the palace adapting as it was designed to, and the guard felt the weight of the decision settle fully now, no longer hypothetical. He documented the unauthorized contact in formal terms as he walked, each detail entered with restraint, aware that the record would be scrutinized for tone as much as content. And when the official protested, citing misunderstanding, the guard acknowledged the statement and continued, neither agreeing nor arguing. At the junction, he transferred custody to internal security oversight, briefed them concisely, and returned to the residential corridor, where the welfare team was already present, speaking softly, their presence calm and unintrusive. He observed from a respectful distance as the child accepted a blanket, the missing slipper retrieved and returned, the small ritual of normalcy restoring a measure of balance, and noted the Princess Anne's posture ease by degrees, though her expression remained guarded. The guard completed the lockdown report and transmitted it, knowing that this action would draw attention he could no longer modulate, and took up position at the corridor entrance, a visible constant in a night that had shifted irrevocably. The palace settled into its adjusted state, systems humming steadily, and as the first formal inquiries began to move through the channels he had opened, the guard remained where he was, his role unchanged, his choice made, understanding that the visitor had been identified, the child protected, and that whatever followed would unfold under light rather than silence.
The guard initiated the full incident protocol at precisely 2:14, not because the hour mattered, but because the sequence did, and the system acknowledged with a soft confirmation tone that blended into the palace's nocturnal hum as access hierarchies shifted and oversight channels opened. He stood at the West Wing control node while the lockdown propagated, watching status indicators change from advisory to enforced, each transition logged automatically now, beyond his discretion, and he felt the subtle relief that came with relinquishing sole control, even as it narrowed his options. Senior oversight requested an immediate briefing, and he provided it, standing, voice level, facts ordered, the missing log entry presented without conjecture, the camera blackout described by duration and method, the unauthorized access recorded by clearance tier rather than name, letting the structure of the report carry its own weight. Resistance arrived quietly, not as confrontation, but as suggestion, a senior voice proposing internal resolution, discretion for the sake of stability, and the guard listened, acknowledged the concern, and restated the child protection trigger that mandated escalation, regardless of outcome, his phrasing precise enough to leave no interpretive gap. He was instructed to remain available, which he would have done regardless, and as the channel closed, he returned his attention to the corridor, where the presence of additional guards had become normalized, their movements synchronized, their expressions neutral. The welfare team completed their assessment and withdrew with minimal disturbance, leaving Princess Anne and the child settled, doors secured under monitored privacy, and the guard noted the timestamp of their departure, another anchor in the record. He reviewed the internal logs one final time, ensuring no discretionary notes remained unfiled, converting provisional buffers into formal entries, aware that the act of writing fixed events in a way memory did not, stripping them of ambiguity and intent alike. The palace felt smaller under lockdown, corridors shortened by sealed access, the architecture asserting control through limitation,
and the guard accepted the discomfort of it, understanding that containment was not punishment but prevention. When oversight returned with a request to identify the official by name, he complied, attaching the clearance history he had compiled, the pattern laid out without commentary, and felt the shift then, the moment when the issue passed fully out of his hands and into an apparatus designed to move slower but leave fewer gaps. He remained at post as dawn approached incrementally, light pressing faintly against the high windows, and considered not the outcome, which he could not influence now, but the process he had followed, measuring it against the standards he had internalized over a career built on predictability. The palace continued to function, staff rerouted, routines adjusted, the night's irregularity absorbed into procedure, and the guard stood as witness to the transition, his role unchanged even as the implications widened beyond the corridor he had first sealed. By the time the first daylight briefing convened, the West Wing remained secured, the lockdown downgraded to controlled access under oversight authority, and the guard delivered his final statement in person, posture formal, eyes forward, answering questions directly and without embellishment, resisting the subtle invitations to speculate or soften, because accuracy, he knew, was its own defense. The senior officials present were measured, their inquiries careful, not because the matter was trivial, but because its ramifications were not, and the guard observed the recalibration of influence as documentation displaced assumption, authority compelled to respond to evidence rather than expectation. When he was dismissed, it was without commendation or censure, a neutrality that carried its own weight, and he returned to the corridor one last time before his shift ended, confirming seals, acknowledging the guards who would replace him, and ensuring continuity where disruption had occurred. Princess Anne passed briefly with an escort, her expression composed, her attention momentarily meeting his in a way that conveyed acknowledgment without obligation, and the child walked beside her, slipper matched, steps steadier, and the guard noted the restoration of small order as sufficient outcome for his part. An internal notice circulated shortly thereafter, terse and procedural, announcing an investigation, access suspensions enacted pending review, language chosen to stabilize rather than inflame, and the guard read it once, then closed the feed, aware that the process would now move at a pace he could neither hasten nor halt. As he handed over his equipment and signed off duty, the physical weight of the night settled into fatigue rather than doubt, his actions already fixed in the system, subject to scrutiny he accepted as necessary. Outside the West Wing, the palace resumed its broader rhythm, sunlight revealing nothing of the earlier disruption, stone and glass indifferent to the human decisions made within, and the guard stepped into that continuity without ceremony. He did not consider himself vindicated or burdened, only aligned, having chosen adherence to a duty that did not negotiate with convenience or rank. The cost would unfold in meetings and memos, in reputations adjusted and access redefined, but the essential outcome remained: a child protected, a misuse recorded, a silence broken in favor of process. And the guard carried that knowledge with the same restraint he had carried his authority, quietly, professionally, and without expectation of recognition, as the palace closed the chapter and moved forward under rules that for once had held.